Hello again. And to conclude the first New Deal, what now are we going to do directly to help the unemployed and the homeless? And Roosevelt had a much greater sense of urgency than Hoover did. And they're concerned now with putting people to work from the federal government assuming this responsibility. And the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, headed by FDR's right-hand man, the social worker Harry Hopkins, it was the first effort to deal with massive unemployment. And it sent money to states to spend on the unemployed and homeless. And after the state-sponsored programs funded by FERA proved inadequate, Congress created the Civil Works Administration in November of 1933. It was the first large-scale federal experiment with work relief, hiring people directly on the government payroll at competitive wages. Several states had done so before, but never the national government. And when the program's costs skyrocketed over $1 billion, Roosevelt is still very conservative. He dissolves this in early 1934, and what happens? All those people just became unemployed again because there's no private sector jobs available. A very successful program was the Civilian Conservation Corps. And there's a nice picture of some of the gentlemen involved in this. This was directed by Army officers and foresters, and it was a semi-military organization. And it was very, very successful. It was managed by the War Department. It built 2,500 rustic camps in 47 states. And a lot of these things became forts then when World War II broke out. They've already been established. 3 million unemployed were taken in, mostly unmarried young men aged 18 to 25, and the CCC also recruited 150,000 jobless military veterans and 85,000 Native Americans, housing them in separate camps. The Federal Housing Administration and the National Industrial Recovery Act will be two other measures because people are going bankrupt, as we mentioned previously. So, the Federal Housing Administration offered home mortgages now of much longer duration, and we've had this style of home mortgage payments ever since. They're put out into years. 25 years, 30-year loans can be secured, and as a result, your monthly payments are now much lower. And the National Industrial Recovery Act created the Public Works Administration, granting $3.3 billion for the construction of government buildings, highways, bridges, dams, all kinds of infrastructure improvements. And the second and most controversial part of the National Industrial Recovery Act was the creation of the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, headed by Hugh Johnson, a hard-drinking retired Army general known for his administrative expertise, but he's also a blustering, dictatorial, appealing bureaucrat. The NRA represented a radical shift in the federal government's role in the economy. Never before in peacetime had Washington bureaucrats taken charge of setting prices, wages, and standards for working conditions. This is central planning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the same thing that's going on in the Soviet Union at that time. Yet the NRA did have an enduring mark. And this was a permanent impact on American society. Why do we have a 40-hour week? Because it's been around since the 1930s. Minimum wages have been around ever since the 30s. And now, finally, child labor is abolished. And the NRA's endorsement of collective bargaining will not really be too effective in the first New Deal. That will be talked about in the second New Deal coming up in a later video. And here's the National Recovery Administration defined. Again, it creates codes of fair competition, and it comes to be dominated by the large corporations. And fair labor policies, and again, the national minimum wage come out of this particular executive bureaucracy. The Agricultural Adjustment Act will be another FDR administration bill that gets passed by Congress. And they're going to pay farmers not to grow crops. We still have versions of this program today in the 21st century. And eventually, A few years later, it's going to be declared unconstitutional because this is unprecedented federal government involvement in the economy. And that court case will dissolve the AAA at that time. And then in the second New Deal, another version of this will be passed. Regional planning comes in with the Tennessee Valley Authority. And it's one of the most innovative programs of the first New Deal. It was an ambitious venture designed to bring electrical power, flood control, and jobs to Appalachia, the desperately poor mountainous region that included West Virginia, Western Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, Eastern Tennessee, and Northern Georgia and Alabama. They're still living in the 19th century in that part of the United States. And the Norris Dam was essential to creating jobs and expanding power production, electrical power production under the TVA. The TVA is still with us today. Eleanor Roosevelt redefines what the First Lady does. She is FDR's legs, and she is a very, very enormous political asset. And she's one of the most influential leaders of her times in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And never before had a First Lady been so engaged in public life. She has tireless compassion because of the loneliness she had experienced growing up and the sense of betrayal that she felt upon learning that her husband had fallen in love with Lucy Mercer, her personal secretary. And the bottom dropped out of my own particular world, she recalled, but she soldiered on, and she is an advocate for the poor, minorities, and she is a huge political figure. Again, she's out and about traversing the country, something that FDR cannot do very easily with the symptoms of the paralysis that he had from polio. And this ends the first New Deal.